You know, she just got finished getting groped by the Frankie Lyman. Here comes John Lennon, a Libra, trying to dig in them guts. If you have not already done so, please remember to like, share the Facebook, subscribe, and visit uptopbeauty.com for this Hilda hat. We have them in black with the white flower, as you see, and also black with the black flower, and it is adjustable. And if you are not already a part of this book club, please hit the Patreon link below and or the join button here on the YouTube, and for a small monthly fee of $5, you babies, yes you can be privy to all the shenanigans before the YouTube gets it, if the YouTube gets it. Now, let's continue talking about Be My Baby by Ronnie Spector. Y'all, it's getting good, y'all. The Ronettes can still do the tour without you. We'll just get your cousin Elaine to fill in while you're in the studio. I have to admit, it was a good plan. Elaine had been with the Ronettes at the very beginning when we did amateur nights at the Apollo. And with our family resemblance, she could have passed for any one of us. So that's how it was settled. Elaine stepped in for the first couple of weeks of the Dick Clark's tour, and I rejoined the show like clockwork a few weeks later. Of course, since Nadra and Estelle were on tour while I recorded Baby I Love You, we ended up recording that one without the other two Ronettes. We didn't think all that much about it at the time, as long as Nadra and Estelle appeared at our live shows and continued to share the credit and the money. Who should complain? It never occurred to us that this all might be a part of some plan Phil had to separate me from Nadra and Estelle so he could have me all to himself. But that thought would cross my mind plenty of times in the years to come. A Christmas Gift for You came out in November of 1963. But in spite of all the work we put into it, the album was one of Phil's biggest flops. It was reissued as the Phil Spector Christmas album in the early 70s, and nowadays people talk about it like it's one of the greatest albums in rock and roll history. But nobody bought it when it first came out. President Kennedy had been shot a few days before it was released, and after that people were too depressed to even look at a rock and roll record, and they stayed that way until well into New Year of 1964, when, thank God, 4 long-haired English guys finally got them to go back into the record stores. I can still remember sitting on the bench at Heathrow Airport with my mom and the other Ronettes while we waited for the guy from our English record company to come pick us up. We must have been quite a sight in the Heathrow waiting room. 3 black American girls sitting with their legs all crossed the same way. Our 3 identical, enormous hairdos piled a foot or so over our heads. When our young chaperone finally showed up, he was all smiles. "I was afraid I might not recognize you," he said when he saw us, "but something tells me you're the Ronettes." He said his name was Tony King, and then he explained that Decca Records, our British label, had assigned him to watch over us while we were in London. "My job," he told us, "is to make sure you don't get bored while you're here." And we were about to find out that this guy took his job very seriously. On our first night there, he took us to a party where we met the Beatles. George, John, and Ringo had already arrived when we got to the party. The Beatles hadn't been to America at that time, so we didn't know their music, but we sure knew who they were. All anyone talked about in England was the Beatles. That's why we were so shocked when they came up and introduced themselves as fans of our music. Didn't I tell you that Frankie Lyman was a weasel? Okay, I told you Them damn Liebermen be weasels. And I know y'all be in the comments, Nay, leave us alone. Y'all must know y'all weasels. You know what kind of power you have over women or men, whatever it is you do. Child, let me tell you that goddamn John Lennon took a shine to Ronnie Spector. You know, she just got finished getting groped by the Frankie Lyman. Here comes John Lennon, a Libra, trying to dig in them guts. So they at the party. The Beatles, or who is it that's there? George, John, and Ringo is smitten with the girl. Every time we'd start to dance, John would come over and say, I don't know if I've got this one yet, Ronnie. I may need some extra instruction. It didn't take me long to figure out that he liked me. After Estelle started getting the same signals from George, we met in the ladies' room to compare notes. Estelle, I said, I think George really likes you. I know, she said, and John's going bonkers over you. Isn't it great? Estelle had a guy waiting for her back in New York, and I was already seeing Phil by that time. But we were young and in a foreign country, so we decided to forget our boyfriends back home and have some fun. Watch them ninjas. Don't forget, when the Supremes came over and they was in a hotel room together, the Beatles was looking at them girls like, oh, they so square. They was trying to get down. They were trying to get some of that supreme vagina. Okay, we know this because this is what the Mary Wilson book told us. The Beatles was like, hey, what you girls into? Whenever a group of guys ask a group of girls, what are you guys into? That means let's get down to the boogie woogie. Girl, they didn't want to be your boyfriend. They just want to get down to the boogie woogie. They want some American vagina. Okay. And from reading the Prince Harry book, what they say about us overseas is that American girls are easy. Tony Hall's wife, Mafalda, offered to take me on a tour of their house. John tried to get down to the nitty gritty. Fuck this tour. So Mafalda finally got the hint. I got plans for this girl. Okay, I want some of this. Mafalda got missing. John Lennon grabs Ronnie by the arm and starts opening doors in the large house. One of the doors they opened was a door that had Estelle and George in it. Okay, they already sitting on the bed, Google-eyeing. Ain't no speculation about what happened because Ronnie didn't put it in the book. Finally, John found an empty room. And when I say he tried to woo them panties up off her, ooh, they was sucking face and everything, but it didn't work. I liked talking to John. He was the first guy I'd ever met who knew how strange it was to go from being a nobody to the biggest thing in the country overnight. He told me about the days before he made it big, how he used to sit around coffee shops with the other Beatles while their manager went out and tried to get them a record contract. We'd sit there with our jam buddies and saying, when we get our record contract, everything's going to change. We'll never have to eat another jam buddies as long as we live. What the fuck is a jam buddy? Is that a peanut butter and jelly? Then we got our record contract, and you know what happened? Nothing really changed, I answered in all my 20-year-old wisdom. Nope. Turns out we were right. Everything did change. I felt pretty close to John right then, like he understood all the things I wanted to know. I knew he was one of these heavy-brained people just like Phil. And I could also tell John liked me for more than just my voice. When he leaned over and started kissing me, I have to admit, he made me forget about Phil for a few seconds, but just a few. John started moving his hands around in places I didn't even know I had. I didn't resist when he slid his hands down around my waist and pulled me up onto my feet. But I panicked in an instant when I saw where he was trying to move me. We were only about 1.5 feet from Tony Hall's big king-sized bed. And I knew that if I didn't decide what I wanted to do pretty soon, there wouldn't be any decision to make. That's when my thoughts turned to Phil. Now, when it comes down to choosing, I would have chose a Beatle over a Spector. John was a great guy, but I loved Phil, and that's all there was to it. John was still trying to move me over to the bed when I dug my feet into the rug and stopped him short. Do you think we could go back down to the party? I asked. I knew it sounded corny, but I couldn't think of what else to say. Estelle and I went out on double dates with John and George a couple of more times before we left London. They'd take us to these romantic white tablecloth restaurants, but once we got there, all they'd want to talk about was American rock and roll. Tell us about the Temptations, George would say. Then John would ask, what's Benny King really like? So we just go down the list telling them stories about all the acts we worked with at the Brooklyn Fox. And as we talked, John and George would sit there like they were hypnotized. Child, that's because your mammy was sitting at the table. I'm sure they were very much interested in black music because that's the same thing that Mary Wilson said. But at the same time, your mammy sitting right there. I mean, you can't expect for the Beatles to look you girls in the face and be like, when you gonna let me dig in them guts, girl? On January 6, 1964, we left London for Harrow, which was the first stop on our cross-country tour of England with the Rolling Stones. We rode in the same bus as the Stones, but unlike with the Beatles, we didn't warm up to these guys for a long time. Or I should say, they didn't warm up to us because we tried our best to be friendly to them. But no matter what we did, we couldn't get these guys to talk to us. It was weird. We'd do a show and then afterward we'd be looking around for the guys. We couldn't figure out why they were avoiding us. Come to find out, child. That's because Phil the Crazy Spector called down there to the London and was like, excuse me, Mr. Rolling Stone in charge of person. Don't let none of them stones touch my girls, especially Veronica. When Phil showed up in London at the end of January, I was glad to see him. But I was also a little sorry because I knew we wouldn't have nearly as much fun with him there. He hated going to clubs, and there was no way I could go out without him. But as it turned out, we still had a good time after Phil got there. It was just a different kind of fun. He'd bought a brand new song over to England, and we ended up having a blast working it out in our suite. Phil was there to be a cock blocker. Phil never came out and said it, but I could tell he didn't like the idea of us spending too much time with the Beatles. I don't think his ego could stand the competition. The Beatles were leaving to start their first U.S. tour in a few days when John asked me if I wanted to fly back with them on their chartered jet. I didn't have the nerve to ask Phil if it was okay, so I had my mom make the suggestion. You know, Phil, she told him, it might be good publicity if the girls went back on the jet with the Beatles. No, he told her, I've already bought their tickets. And that was all he said. Nadra, Estelle, Mom, and I were on a flight back to New York the very next day. But child, get this. Okay? When I tell you, the universe works in strange ways, especially with a strange mother fricker like Phil Spector. Beatlemania was televised. So they recorded the Beatles getting off the jet that landed in America. Guess who was on the fucking jet with him? Philip the Spector. Ronnie was mad as shit. She was like, I can't go on a jet, but Phil can go on a jet? Yeah, because Phil's trying to nurture a relationship with them. He want to work with them so he can get some money. Okay, and I'm sure the Beatles want to work with Phil Spector too. I almost fainted when I looked at the TV and saw Phil Spector following the Beatles out of their plane. I wanted to strangle him, girl. Strangle. That's it. Because he going to do a whole hell of a lot more to you, girl, in years to come. They're back in New York. John still trying to work on that Ronnie Spector vagina. He trying his hardest. I give him an A for effort. I know all about you and Phil. he interrupted. I just thought you and I might have something too. We went on talking about what a great relationship he and I could have, but I wasn't listening very closely. My eye just kept drifting over to the king-size bed that was less than 4 feet away. I mean, I did have a mother who warned me about these situations. Girl, you know they... girl! She keep ending up in her rooms by herself with John Lennon. I told you, man, them damn Libra men be weasels. Watch us, man. And in all honesty, I knew my feelings for John wasn't a sexual attraction. I loved his sense of humor, and I loved the way we could talk all night, but I was so head over heels in love with Phil, and I knew it just wasn't going to happen between me and him. Girl, she checked. Even though it's bullshit, because you know Leos and Libras, they're like the ultimate match for each other, because it's just like basically we just throw smoke up each other's asses all day and we entertain each other's foolishness and goofiness. It just works. Ronnie was like, look, I respect you as a friend, not a boyfriend, John. The next day, John called my house acting like nothing had happened. We're going to make an escape today, and we want to get some real New York food. I knew this was John's way of apologizing, so I played along. I know just the place, I told him. If you don't mind coming up to Harlem, we'll be there. That night, the Beatles picked us up in a limousine for a feast of ribs and chicken at Sherman's Barbecue. After the Ronettes got back from England, Phil and I grew closer than ever. By early 1964, I knew he wasn't perfect. I knew he had a temper and that he could be jealous around other men. But I figured I'd seen him at his worst, and it wasn't really all that bad.